We're covering the introduction to the topic and risk factors. Our group members are Kelsey, Carla, Wilson, and myself. And I'm going to start by talking about the topic in general and a little bit of the history of child abuse. Okay. So the history of child abuse follows a progression which goes from pretty low appreciation of child's rights to further progression, but we still have room to grow. In the Middle Ages, the right to live was bestowed by the father, so the mother didn't have any say at all to whether the child even got to live or not. Which is pretty intense. Infanticide was common but eventually forbidden, and that was mostly due to horrible living conditions. And at times, children were even abused so that they could earn more money for their families because they looked like they were in need. And then in the 16th century, the Reformation brought about Protestantism, and the children were seen as the fragile children of God. So in that new light, there was a little bit more appreciation for the needs of children, but still strict discipline ensued. The whole idea of spare the rod, spoil the child was still the general rule of thumb in terms of raising children. And that you can see in the picture above, that's sort of the whole aura around education with the rod as part of the authoritarian discipline. And then in the Enlightenment era, Locke and Rousseau viewed children as simply a blank slate or tabula rasa, and the idea is that they come into the world open and ready to receive information, and it's our duty as parents and external influences to inure them with a sense of moral framework. So there's a huge responsibility on the part of teachers and parents to teach them how to be people in the world. And then in the Industrial Revolution, we started seeing a lot of issues around child labor because there was a lot of jobs to be filled in big factories with machines, and they would have little children do those jobs. And new immigrants to the United States were looking desperately for work, so they would send their children to go into the factories. And there wasn't really any sense that we needed any type of labor laws until the Breaker Boys, which was a job given to boys who would go and sit in coal mining industry and sort through bits of coal with their fingers. And it was such brutal conditions for the children, 10 to 14-hour week, an hour days, that people started being upset by this, and it started to bring about a movement towards actually having child labor laws. And then along with the New Deal, President Roosevelt, we had the Fair Labor Standards Act, which started officially putting in place standards that protected children against abuse in the workplace, as well as guaranteed things like minimum wage and maximum hour workday. All right, next slide.
So in terms of child labor laws, prior to 1800, there was essentially non-existent. That's when the first child labor laws were put into place. By 1900, all states had, all states at least in the Union, had child labor laws. Again, we're just talking about the United States. So again, Grace touched on the 1941 Fair Labor Standards Act. And in that act, there were specifically age limits and exemptions for 14 to 15-year-olds. When school's in session, they're only allowed to work 18 hours per week, out of session 40 hours per week. And again, this is just for 14 and 15-year-olds. There were exemptions for other so-called labor in terms of profession. So those exemptions were specifically acting, newspaper delivery, and family businesses. Embedded is a link to the Washington State teen labor laws, and I would encourage you, as a secondary teacher especially, if you have kids who are working, to just click on that link, and you'll you'll find more information regarding especially teen labor laws in Washington State. Again, that's just for Washington State. I'm unsure about other states. I'm sure that they're different, slightly different. So in terms of looking at the legal rights for children, looking at it in terms of children in crisis, a historical perspective, McCoy goes back in terms of looking at Mesopotamia, and during that time they actually had a patron, they call it a patron goddess of orphans. In Athens and Rome, they recognized that there was a problem with kids running around without who didn't have parents for one reason or another, whether they were lost in childbirth or wars or whatever reason, they were abandoned. Athens and Rome, they established the first orphanages. In the 12th century, Pope Innocent III created these foundling houses. Again, these are for orphans who where in the Crusades their father was killed, and oftentimes it's pretty short, brutal life for parents in the Middle Ages. Now we come to colonial America, and again, this mirrors the Protestant ethic of the father having control. It's based on biblical law. Father has absolute control over the wife and the child. Legal punishment for parents was practically non-existent. So if the parent was maltreating their child, they would not have been what goes in the home, what they do in their home is stays in the home, and so that the state had no standing in terms of punishing parents. Although in the case for many children who were indentured to masters, there are very few cases, and they're pretty few and far between in terms of masters being punished legally for abusing children, and sometimes in terms of killing children. So, but that again was the exception, not the rule of law. One of the landmark cases that really started modern, so-called modern legal rights for children was in 1869, where the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that there had to be humane treatment of the child. Which brings us to Etta Wheeler, who is a Methodist missionary, and her charge, Mary Ellen, in New York City. The case of Mary Ellen is covered extensively in McCoy, but suffice to say, she was an orphan, and then she was put into a foster home, and she was abused in this foster home. And Etta Wheeler, who is a missionary who is visiting the home, heard from another tenant who was in that home about a child who would be crying constantly, and who she would hear that the guardian was abusing her, and that spurred Etta Wheeler to bring Mary Ellen's case to to an outside agency, and actually it was another agent who was with the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, not children, but that Mary Ellen's case spurred the creation of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Again, this is a NGO, it's a non-governmental organization, not part of the state. Mary Ellen's case was one of the first and it was a pivotal case, but based on that, juvenile courts became established in 1920 in 45 states, and by 1922 there were over 300 NGOs who their primary mission was the protection of children. Again, these are non-state agencies. In 1944, in Prince versus the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, it was finally established that the state had a vested interest in children, and as in the, I guess the Latin term is parens patriae, and that essentially is that establishes the state as having an interest, and so that's really the beginning of the federal involvement. In 1967, in Regalt, it's again, this is another case. This was the first case that juveniles were granted due process. Prior to that, they were not given due process by the law. So in terms of having any sort of legal representation, or even any standing in terms of the Constitution and legal rights. There was a very pivotal paper that was published in 1962 called The Battered Child Syndrome, and in it Kemp et al. Established in terms of a journal article the physician observations of signs of child abuse of a battered child. And so in that journal article, Kemp, he posits that physicians have a responsibility to report child abuse. So this brings us to the federal role in terms of child welfare oversight. In 1912, the Children's Bureau was established, and again, that came through, in part, it was spurred partly by Etta Wheeler and Mary Ellen's case. The Children's Bureau continues to this day. It's under the Department of Health and Human Services. And again, their primary functions are policy guidance and research grants. It established the principle of mandatory reporting. The Children's Bureau is also responsible for developing and training social workers. An example of the research is child welfare in-home services by Dorno, Bolstut, and Landsman. And this research is important in the sense that, again, it provides an evidence-based way for addressing child abuse in the home and outside of the home. So in 1935, in the Social Security Act, there was the Child Welfare Services that was established, Section 521, and this act is important in that it puts in place actual federal funding. So instead of just laws, there is actually funding involved here, and it becomes essentially a stick to ensure compliance. So important to remember in this, though, is that even though the federal government has oversight and funding, the implementation is all the state's responsibility. So essentially, the federal government does not have, they don't have, I guess, legal punishment rights, so to speak, to enforce. It's up to the states. So a key act that was established, which continues and is reauthorized in 2010, is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment CAPTA. And
okay, great. We're doing a thing. Sorry.
Okay. And this is established once and for all funding, federal funding for prevention and treatment of child abuse for states, and that funding is only given if states comply with mandatory reporting laws and that the federal guidelines are met. Again, enforcement is up to the states, but the funding for that enforcement is through the federal government. Also, underneath the CAPTA, National Clearinghouse on Child Abuse and Neglect was established, and that's NCCAN. And in there, again, it's a clearinghouse for information on child maltreatment. Aside from the Children's Bureau, you can find information there regarding child maltreatment and abuse. In 1980, the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Reform Act was established under the CAPTA. And this is important because this was the first time that it was mandated that children would have history in terms of the case, and that once that case is established, that their case plan reviews, and then under the Act, every 6 and 18 months, those cases are reviewed on a regular basis.
Great.
Okay. Is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay,
I
great.
don't know how to end this, but go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about risk factors, and I just want to make sure that everybody can see my slide okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so when talking about risk factors, it's really important to remember that although these are factors to be considered, they're certainly not determining factors of what would lead to potential child abuse or neglect. A couple factors in terms of the children themselves. It's important to keep in mind that although a child can never be blamed for being a victim of abuse, there are certain characteristics that can kind of lead to the potential. So, for example, children who have difficult temperaments or might suffer from a psychiatric illness or a cognitive delay tend to be statistically at a higher risk than other children. Female children are at a higher risk in terms of sexual abuse than male children statistically, and younger children are at a greater risk than older children. And of course, younger children are at a greater risk of sustaining injury because of their size. And this is really important for teachers to keep in mind. So in terms of what factors could contribute to potential child abuse in terms of the parents, factors such as depression or low self-esteem, poor impulse control, emotional instability, or even if a parent had suffered from abuse themselves when they were a child, all of these factors combined can lead to a higher likelihood that they might abuse their own children. In terms of parental gender, this is actually a pretty big consideration when talking about risk factors. 87% of neglect charges are made against women, while 93% of physical neglect charges are made against women. And this makes sense in terms of considering who typically the caretakers tend to be. And then so if we look down, 67% of all abuse charges are made against men. So in the grand scope, the percentage is definitely leaning more toward men. But however, this, as mentioned before, these are just statistics and not a determining factor. 89% of sexual abuse charges are made against men, and 63% of emotional abuse charges made against men, with 58% of physical abuse charges made against men. And then these are based on statistics as of 2009. Okay. So one of the biggest factors in terms of considering what the risk factors are for child abuse for children are whether or not there is a presence of some sort of substance abuse. So according to CPS, of all of the families that are alerted to CPS, 80% of the families, there was some sort of substance abuse problem present. And what's important to kind of note with this is it's not necessarily that it was abuse per se, but parental neglect tends to be the largest percentage within those cases. Of all the states asked to report, 85% said that the leading cause of child maltreatment was associated with substance abuse, the second being poverty. And of course, this qualification of poverty would need to be defined a little bit more closely in order to be qualified as a determining factor. Interestingly, and also quite shockingly, parental substance abuse is related to 2/3 of child abuse fatalities. So although what we see statistically is that the charges made against parents for child abuse or neglect is typically neglect, but in the severe cases, they are associated with child abuse fatalities. So it's really important as teachers to be aware of the sort of long-term or potential severe problems or outcomes associated with this. So in addition to that, it's also important to know that if a parent has a history of substance abuse, there is an increase of the chances that the parent will abuse the child. So even if they're not currently abusing substances, the likelihood increases statistically. And then the next factor that contributes to a greater risk factor for children are when parents demonstrate a mental illness. This is important to kind of differentiate the differences between, because although many children, many people who abuse children have a mental illness, however, the vast majority of those who abuse children do not actually meet the criteria. So if somebody has a mental illness, they're more likely to abuse. However, for the most part, most people who abuse children do not have a mental illness. So again, this goes back to these are statistically the findings, but of course everything needs to be taken with a case by case. In terms of the most common mental disorder associated with risk factors for child abuse, depression is the leading one. So throughout the course of men and women's lives, 10 to 25% of women will experience depression, while 5 to 12% of men will suffer from depression. And this is really kind of a crucial point to make, because people experiencing a degree of depression are at a much greater risk of abusing and neglecting their children. Let's see, and then especially an important point is maternal depression and child maltreatment also show a positive correlation. And there's been a lot of research that's been done around postpartum depression. There is an increased chance of infanticide in the cases of women who are experiencing postpartum depression. So for somebody who's experiencing psychotic postpartum depression, it's something that would require treatment immediately. Okay. So we've gone over several factors inherent in the parents themselves. Something else that should be considered is sometimes the risk factors are simply that the parents have a lack of preparation. Parents might not actually have the skills needed for raising a child, such as caregiving or hygiene or food preparation. So these sorts of things are things that actually can be quite easily remedied with educational programs. Additionally, parents might not realize that they have an array of options available to them that are not just physical punishment. So sort of implementing that structure and control in ways that are not physically based. So learning how to engage in that kind of behavior. Some parents just are not aware that they have those options. Also, maternal age and education levels are both potentially risk factors. So the younger a mother is and the lower the education level is, statistically contributes to a higher risk factor for child abuse. And finally, intergenerational transmission. There's been a lot of research that's been done on this. About 30% of various studies have shown that there is an intergenerational transmission. However, there are definitely limitations within this work, and this should be considered with caution. So there are certain types of treatment or maltreatment that are likely or more likely to be handed down. So for instance, verbal abuse is the most likely, and then physical neglect is the least likely. And then statistically, women who were sexually abused are more likely to abuse their own children than women who were not. So there are a lot of theories as to why this behavior is carried on from generation to generation. Some of them include the parental styles are learned from parents, and being the victim of maltreatment can lead to poor attachment styles, which can increase isolation or antisocial behaviors, or related to a lack of empathy. Yes. So all of these factors combined, again, are not necessarily what will lead to abuse, but statistically have been shown to be present in most cases of abuse. Okay. Moving on to family factors.
All right. So, family factors. Can everybody see my screen? Okay.
I see your
I see
face.
you, but not the screen.
And you look
Not your screen.
before it was. You're good. Excellent.
Do we have the slides?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to discuss family factors and then extra-familial factors. So there are three things that McCoy and Keene point out. Single-parent families, domestic violence, and large families are three family factors where we might see higher percentage of children are more likely to be physically abused, physically neglected, etc. So single-parent families, children who live with a single parent are 77% more likely to be physically abused and 165% more likely to be physically neglected. And you guys can go ahead and read the slides along with me, but I think it's important to point out that there is a correlation between a greater percentage of absent fathers and higher rates of child maltreatment, and that low involvement on the part of the father and low paternal warmth were associated with increased risk for child physical abuse. And when I think about that in particular, I wonder about this part about low paternal warmth and wonder if, you know, just because a child is in a single parent family, does that necessarily mean, you know, is there a way for us to be substituting the, you know, role of a biological father with potentially someone else that can take that place and fulfill that need for paternal warmth? And we've talked about this in class, that domestic violence has a huge impact on children. It's estimated that 10 million children between the ages of 3 and 17 witness domestic violence in the U.S. each year, and that this exposure to domestic violence can lead to direct and indirect harm, which can look like aggression, anxiety, low self-esteem, academic difficulties, and stress. Finally, on this slide, large families, which is defined as families with 4 or more children. Children in those families are at a higher risk of experiencing child abuse, and this might be because larger families have fewer available resources, which can lead to stress on the part of the parents, which can potentially lead to abuse. What was kind of odd, we're going to use the word odd, was that only children are also more at risk for abuse as opposed to children that come from families with 2 or 3 children. And it was hypothesized that this is because only children might come from parents that are younger or more inexperienced. All right, so extrafamilial factors, I'm going to talk about lack of support, poverty, and then cultural factors. So a lot of a lot of parents that maltreat their children experience a fair amount of lack of support. Now, this might be because they are more transient, so maybe they are moving around between houses or even in different communities. They might avoid contact with other families in an attempt to hide their poor parenting or their lack of parenting skills. What might be happening is that other families might be actively avoiding these maltreating parents. And then finally, the social networks of maltreating families might have similar challenges. So if you have a mother who could be maltreating her children, she might surround herself with other parents who have similar parenting skills. And so there isn't going to be those positive influences to be impacting or influencing our maltreating parents. Maltreating parents have fewer healthy relationships to turn to in times of need. So again, because of that lack of support, if a mother or a father is experiencing a lot of stress that could result in abuse, they might have fewer positive familial relationships or positive relationships with friends that they can turn to receive that support and then, allow them to develop healthy relationships with their children. And then finally, it's important for us to be considering those community factors that could be contributing to maltreating parents, such as, are there safe parks to play in? Do parents have a place where they can be taking their children so that their children can let off steam? And are there places for families to gather and to socialize? If we're really looking at if maltreating parents are socially isolated, what's contributing to that social isolation? And could it be as simple as, is there an available community center where families can be getting together? So poverty is an extrafamilial factor that contributes to a higher likelihood of child abuse. Children from poor families are 44 more times likely to be neglected, 40 times more likely to be harmed by physical neglect, and 56 times more likely to be educationally neglected. Poor families are challenged by a number of factors not as readily experienced by the affluents, such as extreme stress, unemployment, unstable housing, poor community support, dangerous environments, and minimal access to health care. So, of course, any of those factors can be experienced by more affluent communities, but poor communities are absolutely more susceptible to experiencing unemployment, unstable housing, and any of these factors that could potentially contribute to their to them being more likely to maltreat their children. And then finally, these cultural factors. This section, McCoy and King don't really delve into cultural factors such as like immigrant families, but instead looking at the culture that we have going on here. So for example, how accepting is the culture of violence? What messages are we receiving about violent behavior? Are children being portrayed as innocent or sexual beings? And then what messages are being sent about the importance of patient, nurturing parenting? So when we look at, media portrayal of our families, or the stories that are being put out in the news, major themes that are happening in movies, again, are these things contributing to looking at our children as something that we should be caring for, or are we seeing children as burdensome or what have you? So it's these cultural factors that might be contributing to families not properly caring for their children. So on this final slide, I wanted to kind of move away from just looking at the risk factors. And so I found an article that talked specifically about home visitation programs. And so home visitation programs seek to promote early learning, improve parenting skills, and ultimately reduce the risk of child abuse and neglect. So this article specifically was looking at what are these various home visitation programs, and what are some of the challenges to families being actively engaged in them, and then what are some of the things for home visitors to be considering. So as has been discussed in the previous slides, there were three main factors that this article delved into: maternal depression, maternal substance abuse, and domestic violence, and that these three factors contribute to the maltreatment of children, but that these three factors can also impact families' ability or capacity to participate in home visitation programs. So for example, if we have a household that's experiencing a lot of domestic violence, that domestic violence situation might prevent home visitors from being able to successfully come into the home and provide that support to teach those parents some new parenting skills. So the article then talks about 3 characteristics that really contribute to the success of home visitation programs. So the first one is family engagement. And that looks like, are families active? Is there a lot of buy-in? Are families actively engaged in these home visitation programs? One of the examples of a challenge of family engagement is that we have a large number of families of color who might be involved in home visitation programs or might be involved with Child Protective Services, and they might have a really negative relationship with these home visitation programs because of the previous experiences with oppression or racism that they might have experienced. So one of the ways that we can combat the lack of family engagement has been to really involve our families in the decision making. That if we involve families in decision making, they're more likely to engage and benefit from these home visitation programs. So what that would look like is, instead of just going into a home and saying, you need to be doing these things, it's more about going in and having an active dialogue to really gain an understanding of, where are the challenges, what are the needs of the family, and what do they view as their values and what they think is important to improve their child development, or et cetera. The second one is characteristics and preparation of home visitors. And so it's really important to be considering who are the people that are going in to support our families. So they should be culturally competent to work through conflict or misunderstandings that arise as a result of a family's culture. And they should be able to identify the resources in the community and navigate complex systems to support families in accessing these resources. So again, it's so important for home visitors. And again, the reason I'm talking about this is because I really believe that these apply to us in our role as teachers. So home visitors and teachers should be actively identifying the resources in the communities that our families come from, and using the resources that are there to support our families. And then finally, matching services to family needs. So the visits or the support that's being provided to our families should be tailored to fit the needs of the family, whether that be child development activities, or substance abuse, or maternal depression support. So if, of course, it's important for us to be, of course, these families, our families might really need a lot of support in coming up with child development activities. But if the larger issue is that the mother is experiencing a lot of depression and that's really impacting her ability to care for her children, that's where the focus should at least start. So it's really all about seeing each family as an individual unit and thinking about, what does this family need, as opposed to what do all families need. These are our references. And so now we're going to discuss our questions, and I shall go ahead and turn this back over to Grace.
Okay, I'm going to do the first question. Hopefully screen share works and you can see it pop up on my screen. Okay, so the first question: how does knowing the history of child abuse shape our understanding? So I'm going to leave that, since that's based on my presentation, leave that up to you all to answer.
So in regard to just the history of child abuse, I would say that again, it's sort of, it goes along with that whole idea of the moral arc of the universe, and that it's very long, but it bends towards justice. If you're going to look at ancient history, children were pretty much treated as just as a resource, not really as a child. Not to say that parents throughout and societies throughout didn't honor their children, but basically they had no legal standing, and they were pretty much the property of, usually it was the father in the beginning. So I think that, at least in terms of just the history itself, we've come quite far from that time of, oh, here, this is just, like just like a piece of gold or whatever, resource that we can just dispose of. Now, their children actually have legal rights, so that's encouraging.
One of the things that I think is kind of interesting to consider is again coming back to that the cultural factors, right? So when we talked about the history of child abuse, so much of that abuse that was happening was because it was more culturally accepted, right? And so that makes me think that when I think about the way that that child abuse persists in society today, I really think it's important to not only look at, just what's happening within each family, but again, what are the larger cultural messages that we're sending? And so how can I be tailoring my message to families and tailoring my message to students and children based upon this larger cultural understanding of children and parenting, discipline, and all of that.
And I think about the continuum and where laws can go from here, and maybe the future of child abuse has a future that provides more support for children. All right, ready for number 2? Carla, is that you?
Yep. Okay, so second question. So what type of risk factors are most important for teachers to be aware of? Is there somebody who wants to tackle this particular question?
Sure, I'll start. So I think it was interesting hearing your presentations on the different factors to be aware of, and some of those things, I think my initial response was, how am I supposed to know if those are happening in their family or not? So I think thinking about what's ways that we can find out about what's happening at home without making any assumptions or having our bias be involved, or what's an okay way to find out without making those assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. Right, especially at the secondary level, it's kind of interesting because we might witness a couple things that might be considered potentially problematic, but to what extent are we supposed to step in and identify those as risk factors, and what should we do about those if we do identify them as risk factors?
I'll admit that I feel really, I remember when we were sitting in on our child abuse class, I felt really nervous about, or I still feel anxious when Steve was talking about, how we really need to be wary of asking too many questions. Mm-hmm. Because that would be my initial response to the question that we're posing right now, right? Like, what kind of risk factors should we be watching out for as teachers? Which makes me feel like if I suspect abuse, then I'd want to ask the child more about, like, what the situation is. But again, that goes into that fine line between, trying to establish abuse or determining whether or not I should make a phone call versus that whole interviewing and the fear of tampering with the interview or what have you, right? So
I think that's where we hope we have support at school, counselors, psychologists, that kind of thing, but you don't always, and you're also the only one sometimes that sees the kid. So you want to have, and you should probably see someone that's more adept to answer those questions, but you do need to be honed in just to at least like have a red flag and then know the right people to contact.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay.
All right, we on 3?
Yeah. So the third question is, how can we be aware of the risk factors without assuming that all children from poor families or single-parent households are victims of child abuse? How do we avoid overrepresentation or underrepresentation of certain communities? And where I was really, I'm the one that posed this question, and what I was really thinking about with this is, we've just discussed all these risk factors, such as poverty, such as single parenthood, but how can we be sure that we're not allowing these statistics to determine whether or not, how can we just make sure that we're not making ridiculous assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that because, again, I mean, you can look at the statistics and the numbers sometimes they can overwhelm you in terms of, well, yes, like 83% or whatever it is in terms of females neglect and then males being overwhelmingly responsible for abuse. Again, we bring that, we should be aware of that, but it also, and how do you how do you make that differentiation? And again, you have to look at, again, case by case, and not bring in this immediate prejudice or bias that, oh, it's male, well, obviously then he's abusing his child in this case. So it's, yeah, it is scary as a teacher to have to make those considerations.
All right. Carla, you on 4?
Yeah. Okay, great. So to what extent should teachers provide parenting support and advice to parents experiencing difficulty? So when I wrote this question, I was really thinking about kind of what we've been talking about, that fine line of what kind of support should we provide parents? What is our role as educators in helping parents be the best parents for their children? At what point are we crossing over that line and kind of entering the realm that's not really our territory? And to what extent is it our responsibility to make sure that all our students have the best lives possible? So I guess whatever responses or thoughts that you guys have on that.
I'm going to do a warning. I have kind of low batteries, but we're going to be good. My first reaction when we talked about this earlier was thinking about I care very much about their home environment, but when they get to be in the higher grades, I like to think about ways to have them know their resources to find help. So yes, sometimes maybe it is our job to I don't know if interfere is appropriate, but discuss parenting techniques. I always like to think about what can I ask them so I can learn more about how to help their child, but also empowering the student and giving them resources.
Yeah, and I would echo that. In that, I mean, it's really important for the kids to understand that they're not alone, and oftentimes I'm sure that in those abusive situations or neglect situations, they don't know that they have actually avenues outside of it. So as teachers, hopefully we can provide them outside resources, external resources from the home and within the class and also within the school that they might be able to turn to. So I think it's important that we bring that up.
All right. Kelsey, did you have the last question?
Yes.
Okay.
So for our last question, and that kind of gets back to what I was talking about in my last slide. Obviously, we are not home visitors, but how can we apply the 3 characteristics of success discussed, that family engagement, the characteristics of home visitors, and matching the service to the need? How can we apply those things to our role as teachers? So what would it look like to consider what it would mean to be a successful home visitor and turn that into what it would mean to be a successful teacher?
I'll jump in on this one. So I kind of feel like one of the most important factors is kind of pulling judgment out of the equation and kind of entering the situation with an open mind and almost with the benefit of the doubt while also going in with a critical eye. I think, again, it's that fine balance of, you know, what do we perceive as being right for the children, and then what do the families perceive as being right for the children? And so, of course, what goes into this is, you know, sometimes cultural factors, just family culture. So, you know, I think that it's not easy to concretely define what it is our role is because it's so case-by-case specific. Yeah.
I think, too, just about basic parent communication, sometimes just having the parent feel like you're someone they can talk to or the kids feel like you're someone they can talk to, just that trust level in and of itself can go a long way.
Yeah, exactly. And then also, I mean, just as Kelsey had pointed out before, in terms of like that cultural component, really be aware of when you're going into the home that it is a different culture, most likely from you as a teacher and the biases you bring in. Leave that at the door, like Carla said.
I think that the one last thing that I really liked about that article was the importance of giving kind of advocacy and agency to the parents. And that's definitely something that as teachers we can be doing. Anytime we're reaching out to parents, I think it's really valuable to get their input about, you know, what do you think about the educational direction of your children? What do you think about the social development of your children? And, you know, I think that it's important to be doing this even outside of this whole conversation about abuse, but just something that we can be doing with all of our parents. And so, you know, that really shows the parents that we value their involvement in their children's lives and that we recognize that we're not the only people that have any contact with their child.
I think that's really important. I think it's really powerful way to think about it too, because no one's going to listen to you if you don't sort of meet them halfway. And then also, our job is to educate their children, so that's how the conversation be framed. How can I better help your child meet their educational needs?
Yeah, and it's also backed up by some of the research. One of the papers that we cited, the Gore paper, where they do why don't these parents show up? Well, if you have that communication with parents, they've shown, at least with their research, that they're more than happy to step in and communicate with you and learn how to be better, how they can be more involved with their children, but also hopefully you can interdict or whatever, cut off some behaviors that maybe that they're not aware of.
Okay, great. I think that's it. End of presentation.
Okay.
Nice.
Thank you.
We're done. Thank